Dakota Territory, 1888. The man was building a wall, not a door. That was the consensus in the small, wind-scoured settlement of Prairie Ridge. They watched him from a distance, this newcomer, Elias Thorne. They saw the impossible timbers he was dragging into place with his exhausted ox, the sheer, insolent scale of the thing he was raising. It was to be the north-facing door of his new barn, the side that took the full, uninterrupted fury of the prairie wind. And it was a monument to madness. Elias worked alone, his movements deliberate, his face unreadable. He was a former shipwright from Maine, a man whose hands were more familiar with the curve of a hull than the straight lines of a prairie homestead. While other men built their barn doors in a day from milled pine, Elias spent a month wrestling with massive beams of bur oak, salvaged from a distant wooded creek bed. The door he was constructing was not merely large, it was tectonic. It was 16 feet wide and 14 feet tall, and it was being built in 2 layers, a solid, immovable shield of interlocking wood. The whispers followed him to the trading post. They called it Thorne's Folly. Children would point, men of experience, men who had broken the sod and survived a dozen Dakota winters, would shake their heads. They saw a fool wasting precious time and timber on a project that defied all common sense. A door that size, they said, would catch the winter wind like a ship's sail and tear the entire barn from its foundations. It was not a door. It was a catastrophe waiting to happen. But Elias Thorne kept working, his hammer blows echoing a lonely rhythm against the vast, empty sky. He was not building for them. He was building against something they had learned to live with, but that he refused to accept. He was building against the wind. What did this quiet man, this outsider who smelled of salt and sawdust, understand about the prairie that decades of experience had failed to teach everyone else? To understand his folly, you must first understand the wind. It was not a weather event in that part of the world. It was a geological force. It was a constant, a permanent resident of the plains. It blew from the north with a malevolent, soul-crushing persistence from October until April. It was a thief that stole the heat from every log in the stove, a sculptor that carved the very faces of the settlers into grim, squinting masks. It was a presence that lived inside their homes, a fine, gritty dust on every surface, a constant, high-pitched keen in the eaves that frayed the nerves and drove women to despair. The wind was an architect of misery. It dictated the very shape of their lives. No one built tall. No one planted trees without a desperate and often futile hope they would survive. Every nail, every joint, every plank was placed with the wind in mind. Yet the wind always found a way. It was a relentless engineer of failure. The settlers of Prairie Ridge knew this intimately. They saw it in the splintered remains of last year's fences, buried in the dirt. They felt it in the drafts that snaked across their cabin floors, chilling their sleeping children. They heard it in the sudden, violent bang of a barn door ripped from its leather hinges in the middle of a January blizzard. Conventional wisdom offered a simple, dabur flawed solution: build smaller, build lower, and accept the inevitable. Barn doors were the greatest point of failure. The common design was a pair of swinging doors, built of single-layer pine, held by iron hinges. They were practical for daily use. They were also tragically inadequate. In a moderate gale, they would shudder and groan. In a real storm, the wind would get under an edge, pry it back, and then, with a sound like a cannon shot, tear the entire door away, exposing the barn's interior and the precious livestock to the full, murderous blast of the cold. The aftermath was always the same: a desperate, freezing struggle to nail up blankets and planks against the gale, and the grim task of accounting for the dead animals in the morning. Elias Thorne had seen this. In his first winter, he had helped his neighbor, a man named Garvey, try to save his herd after just such a failure. He had felt the needle-sharp ice in the wind on his face, seen the terror in the eyes of the cattle as they huddled against the back wall, and watched a good man lose half his wealth in a single night. Elias did not come from this world. He came from a place where the wind was also a master, but of a different kind. On the coast of Maine, he had built schooners and whaling ships. He had laid the keels and framed the hulls of vessels designed to face down Atlantic hurricanes. He understood that a structure could not simply resist a great force. It had to be designed to meet it, to absorb it, and to distribute its power through its entire frame. A ship's hull did not just block the water, it became one with the pressure, its every curve and timber working in concert. These prairie builders, in their haste and desperation, were nailing up flat, weak walls against a force as powerful as any ocean wave. They were inviting it to break them. So Elias Thorne began his work. He was not just building a door, he was laying the keel of a land-bound ship. The project started not with wood, but with stone. He dug 2 enormous post holes, 4 feet deep, on either side of the barn opening. Into these he sank not wooden posts, but pillars of granite he had hauled for 10 miles, setting them in a mixture of crushed lime and sand. These stone anchors would hold the frame. The barn itself was built into the door, not the other way around. The main vertical timbers of the north wall were notched and bolted directly into these granite monoliths. The entire structure was being integrated into a single, cohesive system of resistance. Then came the wood. He used bur oak, a wood so dense and heavy it was nearly impossible to work. He had spent weeks felling the trees and seasoning the timber over slow fires, a process his neighbors mistook for idleness. He sawed the planks himself, not to the standard 1 inch, but to a full 3 inches thick. The door was a sandwich. The outer layer consisted of these vertical 3-inch planks fitted together with tongue and groove joints sealed with pine tar, like the deck of a ship. The inner layer was made of identical planks, but laid diagonally. Between these 2 layers, he built an internal truss, a crisscrossing web of 2x6 oak beams, mortised and pegged into the surrounding frame. The finished door was nearly 9 inches thick, a solid, laminated wall of wood and engineering. It was during this phase that Jedediah Croft paid his first visit. Croft was the closest thing Prairie Ridge had to an authority. He was the region's most respected builder, a man whose reputation was as solid as the foundation of the town church, which he himself had built. He was a good man, honest and hard-working, but he was also a creature of proven methods. He approached Elias not with malice, but with a genuine paternalistic concern. "Thorne," Croft began, his eyes scanning the absurd architecture of the half-finished door, "I feel it's my duty to tell you that you're making a grave error." Elias paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He nodded for Croft to continue. "A door is a door. It's meant to open and close. This is a fortress gate. The weight alone will be your undoing. No hinge made of man will hold it, and if it does, it will pull your entire north wall down around it." Croft pointed a thick finger at the massive structure. "And should a real winter gale hit this thing, it will not buckle. It will hold rigid, acting like a sail, and the wind will find the next weakest point. It will peel your roof off like the lid of a tin can. You are putting your family and your stock in more danger, not less." Elias looked at Croft, then back at his work. His reply was quiet, devoid of argument. "It is built to hold." Croft sighed, a sound of pure frustration. "But man, don't you see? It's too strong. It's too rigid. It fights the wind. Out here, you learn to bend. You give a little. A door is supposed to rattle. It lets you know the storm is there." This thing, it will be silent until the moment your whole world comes apart. Elias picked up his mallet. I'm counting on it to be silent. The conversation, or variations of it, was repeated throughout the community. At the trading post, the men took bets on which would happen first. The hinges would fail, or the entire barn would collapse. The name Thorne's Folly was no longer a whisper. It was a common noun, a piece of local folklore in the making. The Mockery was relentless but quiet, a constant social pressure that would have broken a less resolute man. But Elias was not building to win their approval. He was building for his wife Sarah and his young son Samuel. He was building for the memory of Garvey's frozen cattle. He was building from a place of knowledge they simply did not possess. The final piece of the puzzle was the hardware. No standard barn hinge could support the door, which would weigh well over a ton. Elias built his own forge. For weeks, the settlement saw the strange orange glow from his lean-to as he worked late into the night. He forged 3 colossal hinges, not in the traditional strap style, but as massive pintle and gudgeon sets, the kind used to hang the rudder on a 3-masted schooner. The gudgeons, the socket-like brackets, were not screwed to the frame. They were attached with 1-inch thick iron bolts that went through the entire granite post and were anchored on the other side with heavy iron plates. The pintles, the huge pins welded to the door-side straps, were as thick as a man's wrist. This door would not be hung on the barn. It would be mounted to the very bedrock of the prairie. To open and close it, he devised a system of levers and counterweights. To lock it, he installed not 1 latch, but 4 enormous draw bolts made of solid steel, which slid from the door into deep, stone-lined sockets in the foundation and the overhead lintel beam. When closed, the door was not merely shut. It was integrated into the earth itself. The system was now complete. It was not just a door. It was a single, unified structure of defiance. The forces acting upon the outer planks were transferred through the internal truss system, spreading the load diagonally across the entire 18-foot span. This load was then channeled into the massive hinges, which were anchored not to the wooden barn frame, but to the granite pillars sunk deep in the ground. Croft was right about one thing. The door would not bend. It would not rattle. It was designed so that the incredible pressure of the wind would be borne by the entire northern face of the barn, and then harmlessly down into the unmoving earth. Elias had not built a wall. He had built an anchor for his family, on a vast, wind-swept sea of grass. The test came in January. It began not with a roar, but with a strange, unnerving silence. For 2 days, the ceaseless wind died completely. The sky turned a bruised, yellowish gray. The old-timers looked at the horizon with narrowed eyes. The barometer in the trading post dropped so low the needle touched the retaining pin. An unnatural stillness settled over Prairie Ridge, a silence so profound it felt louder than the wind had ever been. It was the deep breath before the scream. The storm, when it came, was a thing of legend. It was later called the Great White Hurricane of 1888. It did not arrive. It materialized. At noon, the sky was gray. At 1 o'clock, the world outside the windows had ceased to exist. It was replaced by a horizontal torrent of white, a screaming, solid wall of snow and ice, driven by winds that the most experienced plainsman had never imagined. The temperature plummeted from 20 degrees above zero to 20 below in a matter of hours, then 40 below. For the people of Prairie Ridge, the Gense Saum Firi in Voif, the world shrank to the size of their cabins. The first day was about survival. They stuffed rags into the cracks around doors and windows. They kept the stoves burning, white hot, feeding them a terrifying amount of precious firewood. The sound was a physical assault, a continuous, deafening shriek that vibrated through the very logs of the walls. It was impossible to sleep, impossible to think. It was the sound of the world being unmade. By the second day, the failures began. Garvey, who had rebuilt his barn doors after the previous winter, was the first to lose them. A sudden explosive crack, louder than the storm itself, announced their demise. He and his sons spent a harrowing hour in the blinding blizzard, trying to nail splintered planks over the opening and nearly freezing to death for their efforts. They saved only a third of their animals. Word, or rather the lack of it, spread a pall of fear. No one could see their nearest neighbor's house only 50 yards away. Each family was an isolated island in a sea of roaring white. Jedediah Croft was in his home, a sturdy, well-built house he had constructed himself. He was a master craftsman, and his work was sound. But the storm was more than sound work could handle. He watched as the shingles on his roof began to peel away one by one, vanishing into the maelstrom. The fine, powdery snow, harder than sand, was being driven through microscopic cracks in the window frames, forming neat, sharp piles on the interior sills. But his main concern was his barn. It was his masterpiece, the best-built barn in the county. Its doors were cross-braced, hung on the finest hinges the trading post could supply. He listened to it dying. The groaning of the wood was constant, a chorus of tortured fibers. Every hour, a new sound joined the awful symphony, a high-pitched squeal from a straining hinge, a sharp crack from a supporting beam. He sat at his kitchen table, a mug of cold coffee in his hands, and felt his entire life's work, his entire system of belief being dismantled by the wind. He had built according to the rules, according to the accumulated wisdom of his trade. And it was not enough. His thoughts inevitably turned to Elias Thorne. He pictured the man's family, huddled behind that absurd, monstrous door. A grim, terrible guilt began to creep into his heart. He had mocked the man. He had encouraged others to mock him. He had stood by, wrapped in the certainty of his own expertise, while a fool built a death trap for his own family. He imagined the moment of failure, the catastrophic implosion as the wind finally tore that massive slab of wood from its moorings, bringing the entire barn down in a tangled wreck of timber and flesh. The silence from the Thorne homestead was, to Croft's mind, the silence of a tomb. On the morning of the third day, the wind shifted slightly, but its intensity did not wane. It was then that Croft heard it, a deep, resonant boom that shook his own house. He knew the sound. It was the sound of catastrophic structural failure. He rushed to his window and peered through a small patch he had scraped free of frost. The white was so thick he could barely see, but he thought he saw a change in the shape of his barn. A new, darker shadow. The north doors were gone. Not just broken, but completely gone, vanished into the storm. His barn was wide open, his prize bull, his 2 milk cows, his horse, all exposed to a wind chill that was now approaching 70 degrees below zero. His expertise was a ruin. His certainty was a joke. A desperate, irrational thought took hold of him. He had to go to Thorne's. He had to know. Was it to offer help? Or was it a darker need, a need to see the proof of his own predictions, to confirm that Thorne's folly had met its inevitable end? He didn't know. He just knew he had to go. He bundled himself in every layer of wool and canvas he owned, wrapped his face until only his eyes were exposed, and tied a rope from his back door to the well pump. And from there, he would navigate by memory toward the property line. He was going to check on the fool on the hill. Before he left, he looked at his wife. Her face was pale with fear. "Jedediah, you can't. It's death out there." "I have to," he said, his voice muffled by the scarf. "I have to see." The journey was 150 yards. It took him nearly 20 minutes. The world was a maelstrom of ice and noise. The wind was a solid thing, a physical wall that he had to lean his entire body into. He could not see his own feet. He navigated by instinct, by the feel of the slight rise in the ground that marked the path to Thorne's homestead. Twice he fell, the wind knocking him from his feet as if he were a child's toy. He crawled on hands and knees, the rope to his own home long since left behind, a solitary man fighting his way toward what he believed was a site of tragedy. He was guided by a grim sense of duty, a penance for his own arrogance. He almost missed it. A dark, hulking shape loomed suddenly out of the white. The barn. It was still standing. He stumbled toward it, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. It was impossible. Nothing should be standing in this wind. He reached the east wall, the side sheltered from the main blast, and collapsed against it, gasping for breath, his lungs burning. He expected to hear the shriek of the wind through a shattered structure, the terrified cries of trapped animals. He heard nothing. Only the deep, muffled roar of the storm on the other side of the walls. It was a low, bass rumble, not the high-pitched scream he had lived with for 3 days. The wall he was leaning against was not vibrating. It was still. It was solid. Fumbling with frozen fingers, he found his way along the wall to a smaller, man-sized door. It was a simple, sturdy door, but it was sheltered from the wind by the bulk of the barn itself. He expected it to be barred, or frozen shut. He pulled the simple wooden latch. It gave way easily. He pushed the door open and fell inside, out of the storm, and the world changed. The first thing that hit him was the warmth, not heat, but the absence of that soul-stealing, penetrating cold. It was the still, quiet air of a cellar, thick with the smell of hay, animals, and humanity. The second thing was the sound. The deafening, insane roar of the blizzard was instantly reduced to a deep, resonant hum, like the sound inside a great cathedral during a thunderstorm. It was present, but it was outside. It had no power here. His eyes, blinded by the white of the storm, took a moment to adjust to the dim lantern light. And then he saw them. It was not just the Thorne family. It was the Garveys. It was the Martins from down the road. It was old Widow Hemlock. There were nearly 30 people in the barn. Their children were asleep in a makeshift pen filled with clean straw. Their most essential livestock, milk cows, a few pigs, chickens in their crates, were tethered along the back wall, calm and quiet. People sat on benches and blankets, talking in low, hushed voices. Sarah Thorne was handing a cup of what smelled like hot broth to one of the Garvey children. In the center of this impossible sanctuary stood Elias Thorne, talking quietly with another farmer. He looked up and saw Croft, a wild, snow-caked apparition in the doorway. He simply nodded, a calm, welcoming gesture. Croft stood there, swaying, unable to speak. His gaze went past the assembled community to the north wall, to the door. Thorne's Folly. It stood there, a silent, dark titan. There was no frost on its timbers, no sign of strain. He walked toward it, his boots heavy on the packed earth floor, his neighbors parting to let him pass. He reached out a trembling, gloved hand and laid it flat against the inner planks. He could feel it then. A deep, powerful vibration, a low-frequency tremor that pulsed through the dense oak. It was the power of the hurricane, the full, concentrated fury of the Dakota winter beating against the other side. But it was a contained power. The door was not shaking. It was not rattling. It was humming, like a massive engine under load. He pressed his ear to the wood and listened. He could hear the storm, but it was a distant, frustrated thing. He looked up at the massive diagonal braces, at the way they channeled the force into the huge vertical beams of the barn itself. He looked at the colossal hinges, not even weeping a speck of rust, bolted into the very stone of the earth. He finally understood. The door was not fighting the wind. It was absorbing it. It was taking the single greatest force on the prairie and making it irrelevant. He turned back to Elias, his face a mask of awe and shame. His voice was a raw croak. "How?" Elias walked over to him. "The wind needs something to push against, a flat board, a loose shingle, a weak hinge. It finds a purchase, and it tears. This door gives it nothing, no single point of failure. The load is spread across every inch of it, and then down into the ground." He patted the door, a gesture of affection, like a captain patting the helm of his ship. "She's not a wall, she's a hull, built to take a wave." Croft stared at the family, safe and alive. He thought of his own barn, shattered, his own animals likely dead. He thought of his certainty, his experience, his mockery. It all crumbled to dust in that moment. The numbers were not in degrees of temperature or cords of wood burned. The numbers were here, in the breathing, living bodies of his friends and neighbors. The data was undeniable, and it was devastating. He looked Elias Thorne directly in the eye. All the arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, humbling clarity. "I was wrong," Croft said, his voice clear and steady now, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Elias, I was a fool. I was wrong. You didn't build a folly. You built an ark. You saved us." He paused, then asked the question that would change everything for Prairie Ridge. "When this is over, you must teach me how." When the great storm finally broke, 4 days after it began, it revealed a landscape of utter devastation. Prairie Ridge was a ruin. Roofs were gone. Cabins were damaged. Not a single barn, save one, had its north-facing doors intact. The loss of livestock was catastrophic, but not a single human life was lost. They had all, one by one, made the desperate journey to the sanctuary of Thorne's barn. The aftermath was not a time for blame, but for rebuilding. And the architect of that rebuilding was not the man who had built the church, but the man who had built the door. Jedediah Croft, true to his word, became Elias Thorne's most devoted student and his most powerful advocate. He put his reputation, his skill, and his energy into spreading the gospel of the Thorne door. The first new doors were built on Croft's own barn, with Elias directing and Croft leading the construction crew. The men who had once mocked now worked with a grim, focused energy, their hands learning the strange new geometry of the internal truss, the unfamiliar heft of the oak planks. They learned to think not like house builders, but like shipwrights. They learned to see the wind not as a nuisance to be tolerated, but as a force to be engineered against. Thorne's folly became the Thorne door, a term spoken with respect and then with pride. Within 2 years, every barn in Prairie Ridge, and for miles around, had one. The design was adapted and improved. Lighter woods were used for smaller structures, but the core principles, the double wall, the internal truss, the deep-set anchors, remained the same. Elias Thorne never sought a patent, never asked for a penny. He shared his knowledge freely, sketching the designs on scraps of wood for anyone who asked. He was not an inventor in search of fame. He was a craftsman who had solved a problem. His reward was the quiet safety of his community. The real impact was not measured in timber and iron. It was measured in peace of mind. It was in the sound of a winter storm that was no longer a terrifying scream in the walls, but a distant rumble outside. It was measured in the wealth of livestock that now survived the winters, allowing the settlement to prosper. It was measured in the faces of children who no longer lay awake in fear, listening to the house tremble. The oversized door had not just saved a settlement from a single storm. It had changed its entire relationship with the world. It had given them a foothold of permanence in a land that had always felt temporary. It had given them dignity. The story of Elias Thorne and his great door is a powerful lesson. It speaks to the conflict between entrenched tradition and necessary innovation, between the arrogance of assumed expertise and the quiet wisdom of the outsider. The principles of load distribution and integrated structural design that a 19th century shipwright applied to a barn door are the same principles that allow modern skyscrapers to sway safely in high winds and bridges to withstand the immense forces of traffic and nature. It is a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come from looking at an old problem with new eyes. It's a testament to the simple, powerful idea that a community's strength is not just in its shared experience, but in its willingness to embrace the knowledge it doesn't yet understand. The story of Prairie Ridge is a fictionalized account, created for educational and entertainment purposes. The characters, names, and specific events have been imagined to illustrate real-world engineering and historical principles. This narrative is not intended to serve as professional construction or engineering advice.